in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, such as people.
The InkuluFreeHeid Politics Podcast. Inkululeko, freedom, freeHeid.
Hello and welcome to the InkuluFreeHeid Politics Podcast, where politics and civic society meet beyond the media spin. Round 2. We're back in the building like we never left. And we're joined today by two incredible guests. And we have one guest who's joining us for the first, definitely not the last time, Elnari Potgieter, who is an incredible person, has had experience witnessing policy making and policy negotiation in the South African state up close, and who's also one of the main people driving the National Democratic Convention that IFH is hosting in January 2015. We're really excited to have her on this podcast. Elnari, how are you doing?
Wonderful, thank you, Sizwe.
And we're joined yet again by Mr. Erik de Ridder. Erik, how's life?
Very good. I'm round 2 and excited to delve into the important issues up for discussion today.
For sure. Thanks to everyone who sent in their comments in the last podcast, who tweeted us. Remember that the hashtag is IFH Politics Podcast. And please ensure that you tweet us as you're listening to this through the discussion. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll respond back to you immediately on the IFH Twitter hashtag, the IFH Twitter handle, at InkuluFreeHeid. Follow us on Facebook, InkuluFreeHeid. So, we have quite a menu for you today. We're going to be discussing a number of things in the current affairs section. The first is this question of the apparent 180 on e-tolls that we saw from the ANC in Gauteng at their recent provincial conference. Elnari, I wonder if I could begin with you. This is a rather interesting development. What do you think was behind the thinking of the ANC in Gauteng when they decided to publicly announce their discomfort with some of the ways in which e-tolling has been implemented by by SANRAL and national government?
Yes, thank you, Sizwe. So if you follow a little bit of the different stakeholders that have been commenting on this, it seems like they've been trying to sort of play towards the voters within Gauteng. Basically, the rising prices to transport various goods and foods have left people who have already a limited amount of money to spend on daily expenses, basically paying more for transport. And there's the local roads are already overused, and the public transport not adequate. And the public transport that is there too expensive for people to make use of on a daily basis. So that's left a lot of people in a predicament. So I think what the ANC in Gauteng then, that they're basically realizing that if they don't address the rising matters in the different community voices, that they might be losing more voters that they've already been losing if you look at the recent elections in May. But also there's been different, like even at the national level, one would think it might have caused a little bit of a tussle between Gauteng and the national ANC representatives, but it sort of didn't cause such a big havoc. So it would be interesting to see what had been the rationale behind that. Maybe you guys have more insight in that regard.
It was certainly surprising to me to see quite such a public 180 on the question. Erik?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what Elnari said. I think for me there are two core issues that relevant to this issue that I think are important to consider. The first one is really the fundamental question of what in reality enforces or underpins the policies adopted by the national government. And if you look at the e-toll involves intervention from a socioeconomic point of view, certainly for the majority of residents of Gauteng, it does not necessarily make sense. I think in the second point, which is interesting to consider, is the underlying organization of economic interests, which we might be witnessing being drawn along political lines and factions within the ANC. But then in there is also the potential for the ANC in Gauteng and for this move to signal an ambition on the part of the ANC in Gauteng to perhaps reorganize that center principle around which the ANC and the national government stages these types of interventions. So there's a different dynamics, I think, as over the course of the next few months. I think we'll see the division potentially grow between the parties, and we'll see, I think, potentially a rebalancing of how the ANC provincial structures relate to the ANC nationally. This is the first time I think we've seen dissent that is this direct and this strong on the part of a provincial structure, and we haven't really seen anything comparable from any of the other provinces over the past couple of years. So it's interesting from a precedent-setting point of view as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's also interesting is that many people feel that the ANC in Gauteng is sort of the last bastion of a return to the moral rectitude that previous ANC administrations and ANC eras have exhibited. And a number of people who remain loyal to the ANC, at least, think that, Gauteng is the central place from which change will emerge, if it is to emerge, in the ANC. Although they haven't necessarily at the national level always been able to get their way. And my only worry and my only question with this is whether, in fact, the national ANC is actually using the Gauteng ANC to perpetuate this notion that there's going to be some fundamental change in the ANC to ameliorate Gauteng voters, who the ANC is losing very, very quickly. But then, just as they dangle the bait of, a more responsive ANC, there's been a lot of talk about getting tougher on corruption as well from the Gauteng ANC. As they dangle the bait to voters, I just wonder whether we'll actually see action being taken. So it's all well and good to say, we have a bit of a problem with the way e-tolls has been implemented. It's all well and good to say, corruption needs to be tackled head on. But will this actually happen? And the question is whether national policy will change and whether we will see a sea change. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, Elnari.
So Sizwe, given my background in governmental policy making, it's a very slow process. It's a very laborious process. Usually there's a lot of speak beforehand, but when the work needs to be done, it takes quite a long time, and the stakeholders are not always that patient to see the results. And then if you have voters waiting to see the results, you don't always act with a long-term strategy in mind, but rather a short-term sort of quick solution-based approach. So even if there is change, it wouldn't be a radical. Even if the opinion and the viewpoint had been a radical change, I don't think the change necessarily would be a quick sort of 180 degrees turn, as we've seen in the opinion itself. But it would be too quick to say. I know there's also by the end of November they will have a report. There's a report being done on the impact of the e-tolls and whether it's effective, etc. That would also be delivered to the Transport Minister. I think it's Minister Peters. So we also have to distinguish between what's going on in the party and what's going on at the governmental level within the relevant department that deals with transport. And there might be a political buy-in, but then it needs to flow through the relevant governmental structures. And that would take a while before it completes.
Well, a lot to keep tabs on. I think certainly an interesting development, and let's watch what happens. I think hopeful that this could signal a change in what's been happening, but I think also skeptical about what extent that change will reach. But let's see. Speaking of which, there's been a furore building, reaching fever pitch around South Africa's foreign policy to some extent, surrounding our continued refusal to grant permission to the Dalai Lama, permission to visit South Africa. Most recently in the Nobel Peace Laureate Conference, which was scheduled to start on the 13th of October, we had government saying that the Dalai Lama had never said he wanted to come to South Africa, Dalai Lama's public spokesperson refuting those claims. And, of course, the traditional fallout, including yet another vitriolic rebuke from Archbishop Emeritus Tutu. Erik, I wonder if I could turn to you. Look, a lot of people have also been skeptical about whether we need to, bow to the Dalai Lama. What's all this airy-fairy reconciliation peace stuff when we have important economic imperatives to pursue? And of course, the reverse case has also been argued very forcefully. What do you think are the issues that people need to consider when looking at this question?
I think it's important to look at the issue of the Dalai Lama visa refusal in the broader context of South African foreign policy over the past 20 years. I think we've gone from a very high degree of clarity in the immediate pre-94 and post-1994 era, with a core set of very clear principles and ideals through which we aim to influence outcomes on the world stage. And then relative to today, where it's very unclear as to what exactly we're trying to achieve with our foreign policy. I think the interesting case of the Dalai Lama presents us with an opportunity to look at our behavior in general across the board in terms of how are we living up to that legacy of pursuing global peace and different development objectives on the international stage relative to mediating our own national and economic interests. And I think the contradiction is very clear in this case. I think the South African government appears to be pandering to Chinese economic interests in the country in the similar way to the way in which the Norwegian government has behaved relative to the Dalai Lama. So South Africa is not alone, I think, in its quest to please some of the powers that be, but that signals a significant departure from the idea that we should aim to live up to the legacy, the foreign policy legacy of the Mandela era, which is one that was grounded in the idea that we should use our influence to make the world a better place and to look to issues that are larger than just ourselves. And I think it also speaks to the toxicity of the maligned interests that appear to have taken root within the ANC government, in that they're unable to draw a clear line between what we should be doing and then what we eventually end up doing. and the long-term consequences of trying to please all of the powers that be will most likely leave South Africa worse off in future than having the ability in the present moment to take a principled stance and say that this is what we believe and we will act on this belief despite what other countries' opinions are of these issues.
Sure. Erik comes out quite strongly on one side. Elnari, your thoughts?
Yes, I think what Erik says with regards to the impact on South Africa's image as a peace and reconciliation icon that had basically been upheld in international organizations is quite a question. We've from experience, I know that often in the recent sort of decade almost, South Africa would often go into international organization meetings and have one viewpoint, and the next day they would have another on the same issue. So I think there's quite a lot of things that need to be sort of tuned and creased out within the Foreign Affairs Department. But also on the other hand, if you look at our economic relations within the BRICS structures and how far that has come, and then being cognizant of that while looking at this specific issue, one can not understand, but one can see how sort of South Africa has been developing in other structures as well in the past few years, and made more regional affiliations and became part of regional structures as well. And I think in sort of balancing that and balancing between being part of SACU, SADC, BRICS, UN, WTO, there's quite a lot of different things that you have to gamble and balance within a policy environment. I would brave to say that this is basically to the detriment of our image as a reconciliation, a country that's sort of one of the countries that you can always count on when looking into being sort of champions of peace and reconciliation. Yeah, let's see what happens in the future and how this sort of impacts on also our economic relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a very important point there regarding the difficult balance which I think South Africa has to strike. I mean, on the one hand, our very foundation is in this human rights constitutional discourse, liberal egalitarian view of the world. Yet on the other hand, we simply aren't powerful enough as a country on the international stage to impose the views which our country is founded on the rest of the world. And I think this has really played out in a number of ways in South African foreign policy, say in the last decade. You know, on the one hand, on a whole host of issues, we adopt a very liberal stance, and I think that there's broad popular agreement on a whole host of issues embedded in our constitution. On the other hand, say we need to group with African countries who adopt very different views on many of the issues which we agree on in South Africa. And so we constantly have to balance, this commitment to values enshrined in our constitution and having to play the game of international diplomacy because we simply aren't powerful enough to get our way if we don't form these alliances. And I think this Dalai Lama question is yet another example of the difficult balance which we tread. I think I would also say, though, that we mustn't simply see this question of us being a country who's looked at favorably in terms of reconciliation as a fuzzy issue. I think this has extreme practical benefits for our foreign policy in hard terms. I think, a number of people visit South Africa because of our history. That has, an economic return. And it generates soft power. And in a country that doesn't necessarily have the kind of military and economic power that can often convince, big nations, what we do have is the ability to say, look, we have the moral credibility to speak on questions of peace, questions of reconciliation, and we don't want to erode that, not just for airy-fairy reasons, but also for very practical reasons of our standing in the world. But we could go on about this question, but that would mean that we wouldn't discuss yet another important question, which has come onto the scene recently, which is the appointment of a new governor of the Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, and this has produced a host of reactions from various stakeholders, and I wondered if I could turn to you, Erik, and get your thoughts on the appointment, and also whether you think this will signal any kind of change in the way that the Reserve Bank deals with its role in forwarding the South African economic agenda.
Thanks, Steve. I think the appointment of Mr. Kganyago, I think, is very interesting, and it definitely doesn't signal a significant departure from past practice in the way that the ANC seeks to maintain macroeconomic and monetary stability inside the country. So I don't think we should necessarily expect a very significant change in tone in the way that the Reserve Bank handles its questions of inflation targeting and other fiscal interventions towards national development. I think in most cases, and when you also consider the recent appointment of Minister Nene to the Treasury, I think the combination of these two appointments, if anything, signal more continuity and less of an appetite for radical change and transformation, which is the official line of the ANC, but the reality doesn't seem to live up to that ideal.
Elnari, your thoughts, and also on the question of whether stakeholders in various sectors will greet this news with joy or dismay.
Yes, thank you, Sizwe. It was quite interesting to see. So given his background, he did work as a DG of the National Treasury for a while. He has a very solid educational background, MSc in developmental economics from London School of Oriental and African Studies, and amongst other degrees. He also worked for COSATU as an economics coordinator for a while. So he's got quite and then as is in his role in the National Treasury, he did get the chance to work with G20 technical teams. So I think he quite covered sort of a wide base of experience before being part of the Reserve Bank, basically. And then obviously because he was a deputy since 2011, as Erik said, it adds sort of continuity. But it was interesting to see how different stakeholders basically reacted. So typically investors were very happy with the idea of a monetary policy that's sort of predictable track. And he's quite known to be a champion of the independence of the bank. And also Jill Marcus, which was the previous Reserve Bank, she basically she was very glad because of the internal, basically because they appointed an internal it's an internal employment, rather than an external person coming in. Also indicative of the sort of it's just going to stay on a certain track. And then obviously because he's worked in government, a lot of the governmental officials basically saying that it's also a good thing that they already have the relationships and access to senior officials from the Reserve Bank. But then you had specifically NUMSA, will have them speaking out saying that he is typically a new liberal sort of capitalistic worker, sort of hawkish in a sense. which was a complete different input to the others. So I think maybe your more socialist sort of stakeholders were hoping for a more developmental approach from the person that would be appointed. But I think he would just continue, keep everything on track as it's been.
Well, I think this provides a useful transition to our policy discussion. And if this is the first time you're listening to the podcast, in the first part we discuss current affairs, and we speak about, often in that section, a lot of the problems that have emerged. And in the second part, we like to speak about the solutions. We like to say what the government is doing well, and also propose certain things that the government could be doing differently. And we discuss a different policy issue every podcast. And today we're going to be tackling the thorny issue of what role the state should be playing in the economy. And this question has really reared its head in various forms over the last decade, and there's been a fierce debate over the level and the extent to which the state participates, shapes, drives, or stands away from the economy. And recent thinking in the developmental economics landscape is also beginning to question the received wisdom of sort of overt neoliberal economic policies. So we thought we'd have a discussion on that. And I think this speaks very directly to the question of the central bank, but also more broadly to other questions of economic policy. Now, Erik. This is an interesting issue to discuss, and I think sometimes the debate goes off track right from the beginning because people sort of put themselves in ideological camps that I think probably they don't even understand on both sides. And we have this sort of ideological discussion. I think what would probably be more useful is to approach this from a practical perspective, to ask, what works, what doesn't work. Before we actually get into the substantive question, do you think that there's, a problem with the way the debate is being had in South Africa? Do you think we perhaps too ideological in the way we discuss it, which is preventing us from seeing possible solutions? How do you think we should be conducting this debate? Because in my opinion, it's probably the most important economic debate we have to have in the country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it comes down to the framing of the debate, and framing it in ideological terms is not, I think, particularly useful because there's a remove from the practical nature and the practical constraints of governing in the 21st century. I think what we know about the world today is the fact that power is no longer completely centralized. The ability of governments to intervene and ensure the success of their interventions relies increasingly on their ability to galvanize broader stakeholders in society behind specific sets of objectives. So I think the question of state intervention in ensuring successful national development and gains on combating poverty and combating inequality should really be framed on the ability of the state not only to intervene through appropriate fiscal measures, but also its ability to build broad collaborative processes that involve the private sector as well as civil society and citizens behind these different goals. And I think the state has an important leadership role to play beyond attempting to simply control market factors to ensure outcomes. I think it has an important leadership role to play in ensuring that all of these different stakeholders over a period of time are moving towards the same objectives. So it shouldn't only be a debate about whether the economy should be entirely market-led or entirely led by the state. I think it should be phrased in terms of how the government can play a leadership role in galvanizing stakeholders behind core objectives, because I think that the fact that power is so decentralized and the fact that all of these different stakeholders have such an important and meaningful role to play, and the fact that we live in a global interconnected economy means that the state needs to adapt to that modality of power and exercise its ability to not only legislate, which is a form of hard power, but also use its moral authority as a democratically elected government to exercise soft power in ensuring the systemic transformation of the South African economy towards one in which there's broader participation, but also one in which the real, true economic potential of the country is realized in the longer term.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. And Elnari, obviously as someone who's also had a great deal of insight into the way a number of the negotiations over macroeconomic policy, for example, have taken place between labor, business and government. Do you have any thoughts on, what we could be doing better to have this debate in a more honest, open way in which the stakeholders come together to do what works, what actually works, instead of what each sector, especially business in my opinion, but let me just leave that there, wants.
So, Sizwe, a lot of things. Firstly, if I can directly comment on your question, I agree with Erik on the idea that primarily it's ideological discussions that are taking place, and it's not conducive to maximizing common ground and moving forward. Essentially, there's a few things that every single person in our country would agree to, and that is, for example, that we want people to have food in their stomachs, X, Y, Z. And it's just the how question. And if you come to the how question, if you look at, for example, putting business in a box and saying that business represents X, Y, Z, it's quite a broad generalization, because you have small businesses, you have big business. Even within business itself, you would have division on what would be the best step for South Africa. I would take an example now. Recently, we're trying to extend our agreement with the USA for preferential market access. Basically, it's an extension of AGOA. And one of the very contentious issues is the poultry sector, which would have completely different things happening to the economy than, for example, your industrial sectors would have. So even within lumping business into one big chunk is also not the way to go about it. And often in these discussions, you would assume that a certain voice would come from business, not allowing for different voices to come in from the public sector, after the private sector, sorry. With regards to labor, or your more sort of, your union voices, who are also often divided within themselves, but they sometimes lack the language that would speak more to your governmental structures as well as to the private sector. And they would need to build capacities. You would need to build a common understanding of certain issues in order for people to communicate on the same playing field. It's like one person playing hockey and the other one playing rugby, and they're on the same field. It's not going to work. So these are definitely room for sort of getting these different stakeholders to have more constructive conversations. If I look specifically at our governmental structures, I think what sometimes is a problem is that we're essentially trying to develop and democratize at the same time, or basically trying to consolidate democracy. And sometimes there are tensions, not sometimes, a lot of the times, there are tensions between the different values and the sort of goals that you are pursuing when you're trying to democratize and develop at the same time. And that is where the sort of sometimes the confusion within policy making comes from for the governmental officials, because they're trying to aim to achieve too many goals at one time. There, I would say one of the biggest things that you can address is making sure that your officials within the bureaucratic system, they're highly technical, and because you essentially have to manage a lot of things at one time, and also to slim down the bureaucracy in a sense to make sure that the people that are managing the different things that are going on are actually experts in what they do, which I have encountered often they are, but there's so many things going on that you sort of have to try and focus, you have to focus the discussion. And that you can only do if you have the different stakeholders coming to a table with the ideals of maximizing their common ground.
Okay, yeah, no. Some very important points raised there. I think so. I'm just going to open it up, and if you have any thoughts, just jump in, guys. But moving to some more sort of tangible issues now. I think nowhere has this debate increased attention from the public than in the question of the mining sector and state intervention in the mineral resources economy. And I think a major problem I have with the way that the debate has gone is we seem stuck in sort of 1985, where we think that any form of state intervention, and this is like the dominant discourse in, say, the major agenda-setting newspapers, any form of state intervention is viewed with the utmost suspicion. It's almost a law of nature that any form of state intervention in the economy, and specifically in the mining sector, is just an impossibility. But I think if you look at the industrial strategies of many of the economies, and I'm not simply talking in Africa now, but also in places like South Korea, the Middle East, Latin America, a number of places in both Western and Eastern Europe, even the United States. Strong, efficient, and nobody says it's going to be easy, state participation of some form or another has actually been one of the unifying themes of the economic success stories of a number of the economies that I've mentioned. And looking at the outcomes in the South African mining sector, where we have, by some estimates, as little as 25 billion in tax revenue per year, which is not even the education budget of a number of our provinces. We need to ask the question, in my opinion, are we getting from private, overtly neoliberal resource policy what we could be getting from a well-run and efficient state resource policy? Now, obviously, there are a number of nuts and bolts that would have to be figured out, but this notion that it's impossible for the South African state to figure out those nuts and bolts is also highly problematic. I think if you look at, for example, take Angola and Nigeria, both countries who have sovereign wealth funds and who run them by all accounts. Now, whether they're of a developmental nature is a different question to whether they run well. In South Africa, we seem to have this debate about whether the state has the ability to run, such an enterprise. By all accounts, they run in an extremely sophisticated manner. There's no difference between a number of the sovereign wealth funds in Africa, Europe, Norway, say Middle East, and a number of private firms in terms of their ability to run the financial dimensions of intervention in the resources sector. Why can't we try something like that in South Africa? Why can't we have some kind of financial vehicle which takes ownership in the resources sector and steers the financial rewards that come from the sector in ways that benefit the population more generally and that don't involve extreme capital flight, low taxation revenue, and virtually no transformation? That would be my thought, throwing it out there.
Yeah, she's going to jump in here. I think I like the direction this is taking, because when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of state intervention, I think it's often painted as this kind of big Cookie Monster type thing, which is just uncontrollable, undefined, without clear boundaries, etc. But I think that lacks imagination to the extent that we know interventions can be staged in a way that doesn't entirely upset the kind of norms and values of an open market economy. For example, there's nothing preventing the state from significantly recapitalizing the Industrial Development Corporation to enable it to buy significant majority stakes or significant minority stakes in established mining corporations, and then reaping the dividend income from those investments to further bolster its capital ability, and then further bolster its balance sheet to be able to reinvest in a broader social, along the lines of broader social and economic transformation. That kind of intervention would play by the normal market rules. It would not upset the sentiment of investors globally, and it would mean that the state acquires significant stakes in the resources complex in the country, meaning that the income generated from ground resources is redistributed into the state fiscus and then used for social grant purposes, education, and so forth. And that kind of thing is also replicable when you think about the ability of the state, for example, through the IDC or similar institution, to buy a significant stake of a large established South African bank. And by doing that, re-gearing the existing capacity and functionality of the bank towards developmental objectives, like, for example, broader low-interest lending to small businesses, and that kind of thing. I think the ability for the state to maneuver in a way that doesn't upset the market fundamentally is there. And in principle, what happens in those cases when the state takes over a significant stake in an existing private enterprise, nothing functionally changes. The only thing that really changes is then the state's ability to use its influence in those entities to then further developmental objectives. For example, an interesting example to consider is the fact that Standard Bank is valued at approximately 1.6 trillion rand. Now that's compared to the South African government budget of 1 trillion rand, gives you an idea of the scale of some of these institutions, and the idea that if, for example, the government had to take a significant stake in an existing enterprise like that, its ability to then pursue developmental objectives through those private institutions is significantly enhanced, because we know that in most cases the capabilities of those private institutions often outstrips the capabilities of different state departments. So there's innovative mechanisms to rethink and reorganize the debate around what's practical, what's achievable, what doesn't impact stability negatively but enables the government to pursue stronger developmental objectives. And I think these are serious kind of policy questions and positions that we need to consider as InkuluFreeHeid, because this is the type of innovation that I think South Africa needs, and it's the type of conversation that I think we need to have if we're going to unlock the future economic potential of the country.
Yeah.
If I can jump in here.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, please.
So I was just quickly thinking about specifically Norway when you mentioned the specific topic that you want to talk about. which essentially sort of bypassed the whole idea of a resource curse, the idea that if the country is rich in resources, that it's bound to be a curse for them. Essentially what's happening in Norway, so they own about 80% of their petroleum production, and they retain about 85% of its net revenues. At the moment, and basically what they're doing is they're directing this towards public infrastructure and to sort of social, whatever means. I mean, I would stand under correction, but basically public infrastructure and social programs, specifically in Norway. I think the question, though, which is a relevant question, and you raised the matter about the ability of our government to actually handle such a responsibility. I'm not talking about the capability. I do believe that our country has wonderful, capable people and structures. But the responsibility of something like that is quite something that we have to ask ourselves. How can we ensure that this is both transparent and limit the possibilities of corruption that may develop from there, which doesn't say we have to rule out completely the possibility of pursuing something like this, as Erik has said. But we have to bear in mind the current distrust, firstly, in our government, and secondly, the various instances of corruption and using state funds for personal gains and personal means. And I think that is why people are wary to just jump on the bandwagon, if I could put it that way. I don't know if you have any idea, specifically focusing now on the corruption and the idea of transparency. Rather than the capability of the government.
Let me pick up on a few issues. I think this is quite a fruitful way of looking at this. I think Erik firstly raised the important point of the question of financing. So let's say we move away from specific industries. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we agree that some form of state participation in, say, the mining industry is necessary. That still leaves the fundamental question, and this is a question I don't think that has been answered by any of our current political formations, about the appropriate way of financing state intervention or participation in the economy in a way that doesn't just leave the public coffers in a state worse off, at least for the foreseeable future, than they would have been had they done nothing. And that's why I think developmental financial institutions are a crucial component of effective state strategies in the economy. And what's actually quite interesting about that question is the fact that the IDC, Industrial Development Corporation, which Erik spoke about, is actually one of the best run institutions in South Africa. And this is probably, I think it owns about 13% of the stock exchange currently. And it's kind of never mentioned when we speak about state intervention, but as a developmental financial institution, probably one of the best run institutions in South Africa. I think it's one of the most transparent, one of the most effective, and one of the most efficient vehicles that we've used for developmental transformation in the last 2 decades. The problem that I have with the IDC and a more broad developmental financial institutional architecture is that it doesn't seem to be tapping into a more fundamental national strategy about how we're going to use the economy for the benefit of a greater number of people. So it invests in all kinds of different places, and it runs its investments very well. But the question is, where are we directing those investments? There doesn't seem to be an overarching strategy that comes from the democratically elected government to say this is where resources need to be allocated. These are the specific sectors, and for some reason the mining sector remains separate from the strategy these are the specific sectors we're going to use. So I think that's the one question. And I think that the IDC does provide an example of an institution which could be used for the financing, or an institution like it, or the IDC plus another new institution, for example, which could provide that surety that you spoke about in terms of transparency and effectiveness, Elnari. But I think other people make another assumption, which I think is crucial. And we often think, in South Africa, we seem to think that the state can't run one of these financial institutions, and therefore we won't get development. So they assume that if it's well run, we will get development. But actually the experience on the African continent is the opposite. In fact, these sovereign wealth funds, for example, in Nigeria and Angola, for example, are extremely well run, but they aren't actually extremely developmental. They still haven't seen public benefit, or those countries haven't seen the kind of public benefit which you would expect from such well-run institutions. And I think that's the question that we need to be shifting this debate towards. Let's say, for example, and we have the skills, we have the resources, I think, to run one of these institutions. How do we know that even when we get a proper state financed vehicle investing in these various sectors, that we will actually see the kind of public benefit that we want to see? And I think that's a question that people often assume will naturally follow, but experiences around the world, apart from Norway, where I probably would say, they've got kind of like reserves for like the next 5 billion years or something. Like their economy just can't go under because of what they've been able to do. But in other places, in the Middle East, in Latin America, developmental financial institutions and their participation hasn't necessarily translated into broader benefit. So yeah, those are the two questions that I would raise. If I was to ask for some kind of strategy in a shorter period of time before we wrap up, do you think there's a strategy that can be pursued here? That isn't just, hey, it would look nice if we looked like this in 10 years, but actually this is how we get there. Do you think there is a path to be pursued? I put it out to both of you in terms of how we can chart this balance between, on the one hand, an economy that functions, that is unmistakably part of the inescapable global economy, quote unquote, whatever that is, but that also has the democratically elected government playing a role towards greater redistribution and greater economic prosperity more widely shared.
Elnari, I'll leave it to you to answer, then I'll add my thoughts.
You just asked me to solve the country's problems for you, Sizwe. That's all you asked of me, eh? I think the first place that we need to start is to unpack the ideals that people uphold for South Africa and for themselves, and what they regard as being development and what they regard as being a healthy state. I think that's the first place to start, because I think there's a lot of misinterpretation and miscommunication, and that is one of the reasons why there is distrust, I think, both towards business, towards labor, towards government, towards the different stakeholders. I think one could start there. Secondly, I think we really need to, in order to sort of address the tension between our goals for democracy and our goals for development within the global reality that we live in, is that we really have to make sure that our bureaucracy is technically top-notch, if I can put it in that way. If you look at, for example, South Korea, what they did is they made sure that all the people that enter as governmental officials they go through very difficult exams. You have to be educated and experienced in the field that you're going to manage and work on. I think that is a second very important thing that we need to focus on, is making sure that we build that capability even stronger. And thirdly, I would think that given our specific relation between our our ruling party and our government at the moment, I think that is something that needs to play itself out, and that's something that needs time. And we can't try to. We need to allow that conversation to play out as it should, before we act too quickly. If it makes sense, it's phrased. Cool.
No, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Derrida?
I think I agree with what Elnari has put forward, and I think the simplest way to look at this would be as to what can be done in the next 5 or 10 years that would significantly alter not only the pattern of investment in the South African economy, but also alter the capability of the state to influence developmental outcomes through a broader look at the mechanisms available to it. I mean, the simplest strategy for me would be to strength test the possibility of significantly scaling the capacity of the Industrial Development Corporation to take on significant stakes in various large South African companies in different sectors, and to then test the idea of the ability of the IDC then as a shareholder to increasingly influence the functioning of these large institutions and private companies towards objectives of development. If you look at, I like that I already mentioned South Korea, because they're a very interesting example of a stable democracy that has been able to foster growth industries through strategic investment and protected development. And even there, if you look at their inequality adjusted human development index, they still score in the top 20. And if you look at the IDC budget at this point in time, they're capable of disbursements only in the order of about 11 billion a year. If you look at the national budget in South Africa, about of the 1.25 trillion rand spent by the state annually, 744 billion is identified as social services spending, while only 142 billion is identified as spending on economic affairs. And spending on education is 253 billion. I think in that mix, there's definitely room to find a more substantial allocation for an institution like the IDC to look at procuring or obtaining significant shares in the private economy. Manufacturing, for example, in South Africa is 99.4% constituted of private enterprise. So there's enormous potential in there as well for the state to play an increasing role as a shareholder and contributor. But I think the broader question is, and this is the key thing about what Elnari said as well, is trust. The first thing is capacity. Is the state capable of executing on these transactions and working in and with the private sector to achieve these different developmental objectives? But secondly, is there enough trust in the government for it to be able to stage these interventions without causing significant upheaval and without there being nefarious or unintended outcomes, wherein these allocations are made increasingly to companies perhaps owned by politicians themselves, or where the outcomes are entirely skewed and the money ends up going where it shouldn't go in the first place. But in terms of your first question about the strategy that we can pursue in the shorter term to begin to test these ideas, is definitely one in in the mining sector, looking to support the increasing stake for the government in the existing resources establishment inside the country. And secondly, in financial services, for the state to look at either creating a state development bank that amalgamates all of the development financial institutions into a larger group entity that's able to support substantial economic transformation in the country, or through acquisition, meaning that the state looks at acquiring through the norms and principles of an open market economy an existing big bank in South Africa, and then leveraging the capacity of that existing institution towards broadening financial inclusion, using the existing debt market instruments to help people move forward in terms of their economic station in life, and all these different questions. I think they're really practical things that we can do, or the government can do, in the next couple of years, but all of them really pivot on this idea that the government should, one, re-establish trust, and two, signal a legitimate sincerity with regards to its desire to really create a better life for all South Africans.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think that was a really useful discussion. I hope those people listening have, been given a different view on the way that, economic policy could be handled in South Africa. And I think, we'd like to be critical on this podcast, but we also realize that if you want to be critical, you have to put your neck out there and also say what you might do differently. And I think, I thank you guys for the ability to do that and for having done that so eloquently. And I think, in conclusion from that discussion, perhaps the best way to look at South African policy in general is the crossing the river by feeling for the stones approach, as opposed to fastening ourselves to ideologies, whether they be neoliberal or otherwise, that lock us into decisions which, the consequences of which, quite frankly, we aren't certain about. We need to experiment a bit more. And I really like that idea of testing. So I think we'll leave it there. And again, if you have any thoughts, please tweet us on IFH Politics Podcast. Our Twitter handle is @InkuluFreeHeid. Facebook, just search InkuluFreeHeid. Like us, send us your comments, and we'll get back to you. If you'd like to participate in the podcast, whether you're a current member of IFH or not, please send us an email at InkuluFreeHeid@gmail.com, and we will get back to you. In the next podcast, we're going to be talking about the land question, so don't miss that one. But to round off, we always like to have a quick discussion about what's happening in the organization. And as you hopefully know by now, InkuluFreeHeid is going to be hosting a National Democratic Convention where we're going to be, discussing policies and charting the way forward for this movement, because we feel that engagement from civic society across the political divide is one of the crucial ingredients missing in our democracy at the moment. Wonder if you guys could, Elnari, since you're one of the chief directors of this process, give us an update on how things are going with the National Democratic Convention.
Thank you, Sizwe. Yes, so we had a meeting this week, and it seems like people are sort of quite keen on attending, and we're in the process of finalizing our list of delegates, both those that would be voting as well as who would be observing. We are also currently pursuing a art auction, which we are hopefully going to have a physical auction. Otherwise, it would be an online auction of basically young up-and-coming deserving artists, the work of young and up-and-coming deserving artists that would be sold, and then the proceeds would be, some of it would be for the convention in order to host it. I would leave Erik to update you on the rest of the financial matters. We're also currently pursuing either hosting it at WITS or UCT, and both of them looked like quite good possible venues and locations, but we will conclude on that in this week, and from there we will then make sure that the relevant media communication goes out.
Great stuff. And Erik, in terms of IFH generally, happy with the way the organization is progressing?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've definitely come a long way since February of last year. And I think it's worth reminding listeners and members and non-members that these discussions in the lead up to the National Democratic Convention will really play a determining role in the future of the organization. So as it were, at this point in history, it's a question of stepping up and making sure that your voice is heard in this process. Because I think the next 5 years or 10 years of InkuluFreeHeid hold much more excitement than the past 2 years have shown to be possible, and I'm very optimistic about, I think, the increasing appetite that we're seeing amongst people of our age and from our generation to think differently, but then also try and act differently in order to support a better and brighter future.
For sure. Once again, if you want to become a member of IFH, email InkuluFreeHeid@gmail.com, or just log on to our website, InkuluFreeHeid.org, and sign up to become a member. We welcome everybody from everywhere, basically. I'd just like to thank you two for a stimulating, fascinating, and fulfilling discussion. And I hope you have good weeks. And thanks for the vocal warm-up preparation. And I think it's been a cool discussion.
Thank you.
For sure. So we'll join you for the next discussion in a couple of weeks' time. That's set to be equally fascinating. Till then, peace. Peace.
Have you stopped recording now, Sizwe?
Should I stop?
We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, such as people.
The InkuluFreeHeid Politics Podcast. Inkululeko, freedom, vryheid.